Welcome to this session on carving of mandibular first permanent molar. At the end of this session, we hope to attain these objectives: to study the morphology of permanent mandibular first molar, to learn to carve permanent mandibular first molar, and to differentiate between permanent mandibular first, second, and third molars. Mandibular first molar is the largest tooth in the mandibular arch, and it is the widest tooth both in the maxillary and mandibular arch in a mesiodistal direction. Before embarking on carving of this particular tooth, let us briefly study its morphology. From the buccal surface, the crown is roughly trapezoidal in outline. All the 5 cusps are visible from this aspect. The 3 buccal cusps, the mesiobuccal, distobuccal, and the distal cusp, and the 2 lingual cusps, the mesiolingual cusp and the distolingual cusp. The buccal cusp, that is the mesiobuccal and the distal buccal cusps, are typically flat, and the distal cusp is pointed. Due to this feature, the lingual cusps are also visible from this aspect. The distobuccal cusp comparatively is more rounder than the other 2 buccal cusps. The mesiobuccal developmental groove and the distobuccal developmental groove are visible. The contact points are at the junction of middle third and the occlusal third, which is slightly higher up on the mesial outline than on the distal outline. Both the roots, the mesial and the distal roots, are visible from this aspect. From the lingual aspect, the 2 lingual cusps, the mesiolingual, the distolingual cusp, and a part of the distal cusp is visible. The lingual groove separates the 2 lingual cusps. The mesiolingual cusp is wider mesiodistally, and its cusp tip is higher than the distolingual cusp. The mesial outline is convex, whereas the distal outline is straight from the cervical line to the contact area, and then it becomes convex as it reaches occlusally. When we look at the surface of the crown on this aspect, it is flat below the developmental groove, and it is more convex on the occlusal surface. Height of contour is near the occlusal and the middle third junctions. Both the roots, the mesial and the distal roots, are visible from this aspect. The mesial outline of the crown is roughly rhomboidal in shape, and the crown is tilted in a lingual direction. Since the mesial dimensions of the crown and the roots are greater than the distal dimensions, only the mesial root and the mesial part of the crown is visible. The lingual cusp is higher than the buccal cusp when viewed from this aspect. The mesial surface is longer cervivo-occlusally than the distal surface. Only the mesial root is visible from this aspect. So on the buccal outline, the crest of curvature is at the junction of cervical and middle 1/3, and on the lingual outline, it is in the middle of middle third. On the distal aspect, the crown resembles that on the mesial aspect, except that the crown converges in a distal direction. Therefore, some amount of the buccal and the lingual surfaces can be viewed from this aspect. And also, the marginal ridge is at a lower level when compared to the mesial marginal ridge, revealing some of the occlusal aspects, occlusal landmarks from this aspect. The distal root is visible with parts of mesial outlines. From the occlusal aspect, the shape is somewhat hexagonal in outline. The buccal surface is wider than the lingual, that is, the crown tapers in a lingual direction. There are 5 cusps visible from this aspect. They are 3 buccal cusps, the mesiobuccal, distobuccal, distal, and the 2 lingual, mesiolingual, and the distolingual cusps. Out of these, the mesiobuccal cusp is the largest, the 2 lingual cusps are almost of the same size, and the distal cusp is the smallest. We have 2 marginal ridges, the mesial marginal ridge and the distal marginal ridge. The grooves, buccal grooves, separate the cusps on the buccal side, and the lingual groove separates the lingual cusps. On the occlusal surface, we have a central groove running mesiodistally called the central groove. From this groove, we have other supplemental grooves emerging. There is a central fossa in the center of the tooth with a central pit, and there is a mesial triangular fossa and distal triangular fossa with their respective pits. After learning about the morphology of mandibular first molar, now let us start the carving of the same. If this is the wax block we have taken on the mesial outline and the distal outline, we know the crest of curvature is both lying in the middle of middle thirds, which is slightly more occlusal on the mesial than on the distal. And the cervical, at the cervical line, the curvatures have also been marked. Knowing the outlines, these points have been marked and occlusally the three cusps have been shown. The same thing has been transferred onto the block. The crown height has been taken, which is 7.5 millimeter, and the length of the root, which is 14 millimeter, is taken. The mesio-distal dimension of the crown is 11 and at the cervix is 9 millimeters. With these dimensions and the outlines drawn, now let us start removing all the excess of wax on the mesial and the distal surfaces. So, as after removing the proximal aspects according to the outline and the dimension, next on the occlusal surface I have marked the flat two cusp and the pointed distal cusp. So, these will also be marked on the occlusal side and reduced. Once excess have been removed from the proximal and the occlusal outline has been obtained, we move on to the proximal side. On the proximal side, I have marked the buccal outline and the lingual outline. As we can see here, the buccal outline, on the buccal outline we know that the crest of curvature is in the middle of cervical third, and on the lingual aspect it is in the center of middle third. So, the same outline has been marked on both the proximal aspects. With the marking of the proximal aspects, now let us move to the occlusal side. I keep the palatal or lingual side facing me and the buccal is facing the opposite side. With this, I now mark the occlusal outline. The occlusal outline is roughly hexagonal in shape. I mark the three buccal cusps, with the distal cusp being more lingually placed when compared to the two buccal cusps. Similarly, the two lingual cusps are almost equal in size, so I divide them equally. Then, if we remember, the crown tapers in a lingual direction on both sides. So, I have drawn the outline with taper towards the lingual on both the sides. Now, when you check this, see that the mesodistal dimension is more than the buccolingual dimension. So, with these marking, now let us get the final shape by removing the excess from all the aspects, keeping intact the crest of curvatures and the cusp tips. The lingual taper, I am maintaining the bulge in the middle of middle third on the distal surface and removing only the occlusal, tapering it in a lingual direction. Next, I taper the lower half also. If you do it in parts this way, occlusal and then the cervical third, you will not break your crest. Otherwise, if you smoothen it out in one stretch, you will get a flat surface with the crest becoming flat. So, now we can see it is tapering in a lingual direction, but buccolingual is wider. So, let us remove now from the buccal and the lingual aspects. The crest on the lingual outline is at the middle of middle third. So, I have maintained that and removed the excess. Similarly, while doing the buccal outline, I will maintain the crest in the cervical third and remove above that. After reduce the wax to the required dimension, now look at the occlusal aspect. I can see that the crown is tapering in a lingual direction. The mesiodistal width is wider than the buccolingual dimension. I have marked the three cusps, the mesiobuccal, distal buccal and the distal, which is slightly lingually placed, and the two lingual cusps. So now next is to carve the 5 different cusps. So in order to do that, we know there is a central groove which divides the crown to the buccal half and the lingual half. So make a groove extending from mesial to distal side. Now to make the buccal cusps, taper from the cusp tip towards the central groove inwards, and similarly for the lingual cusps towards the center from the cusp tips to the lingual. So we have got a wide depression kind in the center. Let us start carving each of the cusps. So now we know how to carve the cusps with the back of the carver, keeping the marginal ridge space intact. I carve one side slope of the mesiobuccal cusps. Similarly, I carve the other slope. See that the triangular ridge is facing towards the center and not to either to the left or to the right. Now let me carve the other. So I have got 2 buccal cusps, and I will carve a small distobuccal cusp also, the distal cusp. Okay, so the 3 buccal cusps are roughly obtained. Similarly, I will carve the 2 lingual. The lingual cusps are almost equal in size, so I draw a groove at the center between the 2 lingual cusps and carve the 2 lingual cusps. Now we can see the 5 finished cusps, but however we know that the lingual cusps are sharp, so let us get the cusp slope on the lingual side sharp by reducing only on the lingual side. For each of the cusps, always try to get a ridge. So from the center towards the ridge, and again from this half. So I've got the sharp lingual cusp with the cusp. Okay, now the 2 cusps are sharp. Let us finish the buccal also. Let us make it slightly flat, and the height decreases from mesiobuccal. The distal buccal is slightly shorter than the mesiobuccal, and distal the shortest of the 3. With the finishing of the occlusal surface, we will move on to the marginal ridges. The marginal ridges are straight and high, so let us make it concave. Pass your cover slowly and make it concave, and then smoothen it out. Always remember to smoothen out any margin which you have carved. So we have got a concave margin. On the distal it should be slightly lower. Now on the mesial again we will make it concave, but not as low as on the distal aspect. Okay, smoothen it out. Once the marginal ridges have been done, concavity is finished. The occlusal surface, we have got the two triangular fossae, the mesial triangular and distal triangular fossae, and the central fossae on the center of the occlusal table. Finally, polish all the surfaces. Remove this excess wax. You can use a divider, tip of the divider, to mark the final grooves and pits. With the crown being complete, let us start with the root now. The mandibular molars have two roots, mesial and distal. Let us mark the outline of the root on the proximal surfaces. Proximal surface, it is conical with a slightly wide blunt apex. So I have marked the outline here, and I will remove the excess from the buccal and from the lingual aspect. When I am removing the wax, I will always see that the taper is more towards the distal side, because the mesial root is wider than the distal. So taper it in a distal direction, that is, remove more from the distal half. Once we have removed the excess from the buccal and the lingual, after drawing the outlines, we move on to the buccal surface. From the buccal surface, the outline of the crown on the distal side is slightly concave with the cervical and ends in convexity at a pointed root apex. This root apex lies outside the confines of the crown. When you see the tip of the apex, it is lying outside the crown of the crown, the distal cusp of the crown. Whereas the mesial outline is relatively straight, ending in a pointed apex again. The tip of the apex, when a line is drawn from the apex to the crown, it lies in line with the groove, that is the mesiobuccal developmental groove dividing the two, that mesiobuccal and the distal buccal cusps. That groove and the apex of the mesiobuccal root lie in a straight line. Then draw the furcation areas, which is roughly slightly above the distance from the cervical line to the root apex. So having drawn these outlines, let us remove all the excess wax from the mesial and distal surfaces. I have removed the excess, keeping the outline in mind, the mesial outline of the root, the distal concavity at the cervical and convexity, and the apex lying outside. Having done this, let us remove the furcation area. furcation area both from the buccal side and from the lingual side. We've almost got the furcation, a through and through opening. Now let us just finish up all the margins of the root. We got the furcation area, the outlines. Let us finish off the final root outlines. Okay, so we've got the furcation. The root length is slightly more in this case. You can chop off the base and keep it to the required length of the root. Now on the buccal side of the root, there is a shallow depression from the furcation to the cervical line. So carve the depression and round off the margins. Polish the surface. Similarly, there is a developmental depression even on the lingual side, which is not as prominent as on the buccal side. So a small depression. The lingual, round it off. These depressions are also seen, which are not very clearly visible, very faint depressions even on the mesial surface of the root. A broad, shallow, faint depression. Having done this, remove all the wax, polish the surfaces, and finally let us mark the cervical line. The buccal side, distal, lingual, and just remove all the excess with the tip of the smoothen the cervical margins. With this, we come to an end of the carving of mandibular first permanent molar. Apply the same principles again for the other two molars. Before doing it, read the differences very clearly, practice, and that only makes it perfect. Thank you.